True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Registered nurse Julie Keown had goals for her life: start a family, purchase a home, advance in her career. She just needed to stay the course while her husband completed his MBA at Harvard, and then they'd be all set. But sadly, Julie's life was cruelly cut short, and she didn't live to see the future which she'd worked and planned for all of her life. Join us at the quiet end for Sweet Talker. Julie and her husband James moved from Missouri to Massachusetts after James was accepted into Harvard Business School's MBA program. Julie was able to work from home, setting up hospitals with medical software, and she believed that their finances were on the upswing. But James had secrets. He was fired from his job for lying. He had racked up thousands in credit card debt. His car was repossessed, and there were issues with his education. So from all angles, James's life was falling apart. Now, we'll never know how much Julie knew about James's lies, but we do know how far he was willing to go to save himself from financial and social ruin, and that would be very far.
Yes, it would be. So we're going to drink a Massachusetts beer today, and I have one of my favorite ones. It's from Clown Shoes, which is a pretty cool name for a brewery anyway. And the beer is Breakfast Exorcism. This is an American Imperial Stout. It's 11% alcohol by volume. Pitch black, no head at all. Very strong aroma of booze and some coffee. And then when you taste it, you get bourbon and coffee. And the bourbon isn't as intrusive as is suggested by the aroma. It's a pretty full-bodied beer. Nice one to sip with some friends and share.
That sounds really pretty good. You know, it's just cold, rainy, pretty gross out today, and I could see sipping a beer like that.
See?
I'm ready.
It's a perfect beer for a day like this.
It kind of is, as long as, we're careful not to have too much. So open it up.
Okay.
Oh, the quiet end is so cozy today. Come on over and get us started. Now, a lot of people have said things about how we do a lot of cases about spouses killing each other. But, I just find it so fucking fascinating, really. I don't get tired of it.
As long as you're not planning something here.
Well, no, it just amazes me that you could marry someone and then do that to them.
Oh, I know. It amazes me that you could marry someone and not really know who they are.
Yeah, and if it's not working out, get a divorce, right?
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, we know that James did not do that, so let's get started.
Okay. Julie Keown was born Julie Irene Oldock, and she grew up in a safe, friendly community on her family's farm in the small town of Plattsburgh, Missouri. A modest yellow ranch-style farmhouse, the family home sat at the top of a small hill that overlooked open land on all sides. Plattsburgh residents had small-town values, and neighbors helped each other out all the time. And with just over 2,000 residents in the town, most of them knew each other. Now, Julie's family grew soybeans and corn on their farm. And like other children who grew up on a farm, Julie and her little brother Chad helped out on the farm from a young age. Julie's desire to help people would lead her to pursue a career in nursing. When she was accepted to William Jewell College, which is a private Baptist college in nearby Liberty, Missouri, she was excited, and she had big plans. Julie was a good student, highlighted by her passion for becoming a nurse and helping others. Now, along with her studies, Julie did make some time for socializing. She was set up on a blind date with a fellow student named James Keown by one of her classmates. Julie's quiet, down-to-earth personality seemed like a good match to James's ambitious personality, which at times could be a bit over the top.
Well, maybe more than a bit. I think he could be one of those really annoying people.
Yeah, he sounds like the guy who always needs to be the center of attention.
Exactly. That's the feeling I get too.
Now, although James was prone to being outspoken and exaggerating with his career choice as a talk radio personality, Julie seemed to be the steady partner who kept him grounded, or at least she tried to.
I think she did try to. I think she really loved him. James pursued his talk radio career at the college radio station and then at a Kansas City, Missouri station while he was a student. After college, the two were married with plans to eventually have a family. Julie took a job at Liberty Hospital, where she worked as an intensive care nurse. Her nursing supervisor was really impressed by her positive attitude and her motivation to learn. She always wanted to learn more. Julie earned a reputation as an excellent nurse who the other nurses and doctors all loved. And when there was a problem with a patient, she was always the first one to try and find a solution. She was just bright, energetic, and sincere, most importantly. So after working full-time as an ICU nurse, Julie took a work-from-home position with the Kansas City, Missouri-based Cerner Corporation, known as one of the leading suppliers of healthcare information technology in the United States.
So is she going to be helping hospitals and practices convert to electronic data gathering and that type of stuff?
Exactly. That's what she was doing.
Okay.
And she'd have to travel occasionally, but she could do a lot of it from home. So Julie and James moved to Waltham, Massachusetts in late January of 2004. Julie had been hesitant to move, but James convinced her that it was the right thing to do after he was accepted into Harvard Business School. Fortunately, they were both able to telecommute to their existing jobs in Missouri while living on the East Coast. So Julie was hoping to get pregnant, but she'd been diagnosed with a kidney disease called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is.
Now, this caused elevated protein levels and blood in her urine during her doctor's visits from the late 90s to the early 2000s. So I'm going to have you give us a little bit of information on that so we know what she was dealing with.
Okay. Well, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and we'll just say FSGS, so I don't have to say that long mouthful every time. It's a kidney disease marked by scarring, that's the sclerosis part, of the glomeruli, and the glomeruli is the kidney cell collection that filters the urine, so it's an important thing. Once you get scarring of a sufficient amount of glomeruli, your kidneys don't function as well, and you start spilling protein. So in children, and even in adults, excess protein loss in the urine is called nephrotic syndrome, and one of the causes of nephrotic syndrome is FSGS. So you have protein in the urine, you'll have some swelling and edema because of protein loss in the urine. Long-term complication, obviously, is kidney failure, where you end up needing dialysis and a transplant. It's not a good disease to have.
Well, no, most diseases aren't, but what about her desire to have a baby? Was this going to interfere seriously?
Well, she would be a higher risk pregnancy, that's for sure, but it wouldn't necessarily cause worsening of the kidney condition.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Well, Julie did seem satisfied with her life and looked forward to having a family. But it was James who always seemed to want more than he had. And he was always trying to impress people with a better job, a bigger title, a more expensive car, and on and on. It never ended. People like that can just never be content or happy. So since the time he was a little boy, James, or JP as he often called himself, and he called himself that at work, had aspirations for his life as a famous talk radio personality. He had been voted most likely to succeed in his 1992 graduating class at Jefferson City High School. So he thought he was going places, and a lot of people thought, yeah, maybe he is.
Yeah, most likely to succeed.
Pretty good.
Now, since kindergarten, James had dressed for success, wearing a button-down shirt and tie.
That's weird.
That's really weird. He must have taken a heap of shit from his classmates.
I would imagine.
So everyone believed that James was going places. He acted older than his actual age, perhaps because he grew up with a father who was well known in state politics. Jim Keown, James's father, had been a respected lobbyist in Jefferson City, the state capital. Now, he passed away when James was a young man, leaving James's mother, Betty, to raise James and his siblings on her own. And James was one of 5 siblings. So he shows up for junior high with a briefcase and a copy of the New York Times.
As you do. Isn't junior high the worst? I hated it.
Junior high's tough.
It's terrible.
And showing up with a briefcase and a copy of a newspaper? Whoa.
Yeah, but he didn't seem to really notice that stuff. He was in his own little world, and, as long as he wasn't getting beat up for it.
Yeah. Although his behavior he had learned from his father, he definitely didn't fit in with the rest of his classmates. I would say not. He wasn't necessarily popular in school, but he certainly was well known. Plus, he had red hair, freckles, and his way of dressing, which gave him a nerd-like appearance. But he didn't let it hold him back from what he wanted. And he wanted a lot. He pursued an interest in debate and drama. He was active in several clubs, including Spanish Club, Student Council, Chess Club, History Club, and the Harvard Model Congress team. He was also involved with a club that taught high school students the basics of running their own businesses. And when he could get invited to a party, he made sure he was the life of that party.
Well, like you said, always wants to be the center of attention.
Yeah, whenever a group of students got together, James worked hard to be that center of attention. He had the ability to fit into every social situation and become an integral part of practically any group of people.
Which was kind of surprising that he could pull that off. So he did have a way with people.
So he could be hanging out with the nerds, he could be hanging out with the stoners, he could be hanging out with the jocks.
Seems that way.
He could fit in anywhere.
Yeah, and he worked hard at it.
Well, you'd have to.
But if he just put his ambition and his hard work in the right direction, he could have done a lot better in life. I think he was always looking for the shortcut, one of those guys. But his ambition and his charm really impressed radio man Warren Kretsch when James first walked into the KLIK radio station in Jefferson City. And he was only 12 years old when he did this, so that's pretty remarkable. I mean, he was basically a kid, but he was confident, and he told Kretsch that he wanted a job at the station. So Kretsch hired James and really helped him to launch a radio career. In 1993, interim program director Mike McCartney couldn't help but like this bold young man. So he hired James for a weekend DJ spot, and James was really thrilled by that. Then he soon began to fill other spots when other DJs were out sick or needed the day off, and he really liked working in radio.
The station had a reputation for their news talk radio and local traffic on their AM station, and their FM station was a popular oldies music station. James, who went by the on-air name J.P. O'Neill, also worked for the campus radio station at William Jewell. He was going to school there. He seemed like a guy who had a very bright future ahead of him, and Julie was pretty proud to be his wife.
Oh, yeah. But unfortunately for James, his radio voice wasn't great. When he first started out in Kansas City, he had a stereotypical radio voice, like he was trying to have just the right sound. But his real voice was kind of nasal and high-pitched. He just didn't have that natural radio voice, and he had to work hard to compensate.
Well, good thing I have that natural voice, huh?
You do. A little monotonous, but I enjoy it. Now, JP's other qualities made up for his lack of this perfect radio voice, though. He had knowledge of the radio business, and he had some connections to the local celebrities in Missouri. So the management at the station picked up JP and waited to see if he would be successful. At first, he was working as a DJ for the FM station, announcing songs and commercials. And while he was working there, another area radio station group bought that station, and James was offered a position as the assistant to the new program director. So he took the full-time job even though he was still in college. He thought that the opportunity was just too good to pass up.
Well, yeah, just on the surface, it looks like a good deal.
Well, yeah, if you want to work in a certain industry and you're offered a good job, sometimes it's better to leave college and just go for it.
Yep.
And that's what he thought. So he's setting college aside for his dream job, thinking he'll probably go back. But at that time, there was a consolidation in the radio business with larger companies taking over the smaller stations. And James went to work in Chicago for about a year, which was kind of big time. But then he returned to Kansas City and took another radio job with KCMO. Now, when he came back, he hadn't changed, especially when it came to his love of having expensive things. He was one of the first to test drive the new two-seat BMWs at a local dealership in Kansas City when the dealership invited the local radio and TV stations in to see the new cars. He had people taking pictures of him posing inside of the cars. And these photos of James in the expensive car was just another instance of him portraying himself as much more of a financial success than he was in reality. And that's kind of what he was all about. You're getting a good picture of James.
Yes, you are. In the spring of 2004, Kansas City nurse Lana Kuhn Anderson was excited when she learned that her friend Julie Keown was assigned to travel on a company trip to Richmond, Virginia with her. Lana and Julie had both worked in hospitals before taking jobs with Kansas City's Cerner Corporation. And even though they were no longer working with patients hands-on, the two are part of a task force made up of persons with nursing backgrounds. Once a month, the nurses all got together to use their real-world experience to improve the quality of the software products that Cerner sold. Now, despite an 18-year age gap, during her first meeting with the other nurses, Lana had immediately hit it off with 30-year-old Julie. Julie was a pretty and friendly woman who people just naturally gravitated to when she was in a work group. She had a relaxed energy that made people comfortable around her. And although Lana and Julie didn't see much of each other in their day-to-day work, Lana enjoyed working with Julie.
Yeah, so as soon as she saw Julie's name on the list of employees going to Virginia to help bring a hospital online with new software, Lana sent her an email. Lana was surprised when Julie emailed her back and told her that she had just moved to Waltham, Massachusetts, and was telecommuting for her job with Cerner. Lana hadn't seen Julie around lately, and she had no idea that Julie had moved. But at Cerner, employees were often able to work from home, so it wasn't that unusual. So the two women emailed back and forth many times in the months leading up to their May trip. Once they were in Richmond, they worked long hours launching the software in the hospital, usually working from like 6 in the morning until dinner, because, they had to reach all shifts of nurses. So it was long hours. Lana was actually still learning Cerner's software, but Julie understood it really well and worked to train the hospital staff. She was available every time someone had a question, and during the time they spent in the hospital together, it was clear to Lana that Julie's passion really was with caring for patients. Lana was also really impressed by Julie's professional clothes on this trip. When she complimented Julie on how nice she looked, Julie smiled and she explained that her husband of 8 years, James, had suggested she get new clothes for the trip. Now, Lana had just worn her ordinary everyday work clothes, and she thought this was really sweet that James had wanted his wife to get new clothes.
But before the trip even commenced, Julie had also told Lana that she hadn't been feeling well. She'd had a stomach bug, she said. And James was concerned about her, and at first he'd been nervous about Julie going forward with the trip. But eventually he had encouraged her to go, just because it seemed like such a good opportunity. So with 2 grown children and a husband who worked as a firefighter, Lana wasn't used to getting so much attention. But she didn't begrudge Julie for having such a considerate husband. In fact, she was a little envious, but happy for her friend. Now, though their group didn't have much downtime during the 4-day trip to Richmond, they did get together for dinner one night. Away from the hospital in the busy days, Lana had a chance to ask Julie about her move to Waltham, which is a suburb of Boston. So Julie seemed to glow with happiness when she talked about the move. She proudly explained that James had been accepted to Harvard Business School, and she really seemed to be madly in love with her husband. She said that things were going so well for them that she was able to put all of her paycheck into a joint savings account. So they were doing well enough, at least from Julie's standpoint. They were living on James's paycheck, right?
Right, and just saving all of hers.
And hers was being saved.
So that would have made me jealous.
Yeah. Listening to Julie, you would have thought that James was the most wonderful man in the world. Lana couldn't help but be a little jealous of Julie's life. She guessed in her head how much money she thought the couple was saving each year, and that impressed her. Lana thought that Julie was lucky, but she also felt like no one deserved it more. So from Lana's perspective, Julie was living a real-life fairy tale with a great job, financial security, and a Prince Charming.
Right. But unfortunately for Julie, her Prince Charming was a total fraud. and her life was a lie that would eventually become a nightmare. But at least for a few years, James had everyone fooled. Now, Julie often shared news with her friends about James and how proud she was of his marketing career. She would explain that he wasn't usually available to make social gatherings because he just worked so much. Whenever someone asked about James, Julie told them proudly that he had a great job in marketing with the Learning Exchange, working to promote innovation and reform in education through specialized programs that they developed for students. James was part of an initiative to expand the company's online offerings, and he frequently worked long hours at the office. He often worked at night, he told Julie, because part of his job was entertaining clients who might be interested in using or financing these learning exchange programs. But despite these long hours, James was a caring husband who often planned weekend trips for them. During one of these weekends, they had gone to look at land he wanted to buy in Missouri. Their plan was that they would return to the Midwest after he finished his studies at Harvard. And during the rare times that James did go with Julie to events, he always worked hard to impress people with his outgoing and charming personality. So from the outside looking in, James was this very friendly person who seemed to dote upon his wife. To Julie's friends and colleagues, it was obvious that James loved his wife and that she adored him right back.
Julie and James moved to Massachusetts in January of 2004. They visited their families back in Missouri that June, so 5-6 months back east, and then they visited. Mm-hmm. According to Julie's mom, she hadn't looked good then. She had dark circles under her eyes when she first arrived. But by the end of the visit, she was starting to feel better. Julie said it was due to the fresh Midwestern air. And when Julie did return to Boston, she began feeling sick again. James also did not feel well, he said. And Julie had told her mother they had the flu.
Right, but when you think about when she goes on these trips, she starts feeling better, then she goes home and gets sick again. It's kind of like Munchausen children, that when you take them from the custody of their parents, they get better. And when they return to the Munchausen parent, they get sick again. So it's very similar in that way. It's what it makes me think of.
It makes you think that something's different, right, about home life versus visiting.
Well, you might think so, but she hasn't, it's not like she's gone that long, so it really wasn't something that would be easy to put together unless you were looking for a red flag there.
Right, and which they obviously weren't.
No, because he seemed great. He's going to Harvard, right?
Right.
So Tuesday, September 7th, 2004 was the first day back to work after the Labor Day holiday weekend. And although they usually went away for the long weekend, Julie and James stayed home because Julie was sick, and her kidney disease seemed to have worsened. 19-year-old Carrie Doherty had been working at the Waltham Police Department that fall. She was young and inexperienced after joining the cadet program when she graduated from high school just a year earlier. So some days she took calls that came in on the police department's business line, and these calls came from people who needed police assistance of a non-emergency type. As a cadet, she took notes from these calls and then she typed up the reports. So Doherty was answering calls on the afternoon of Tuesday, September 7th, and although she wasn't on an emergency line, the calls were still recorded. So when the phone rang just before 2 p.m., a woman's voice was on the other end. The woman was calling from Newton Wellesley Hospital, and she wanted to report a possible poisoning with ethylene glycol. The patient didn't have a history of depression, and life support was going to be discontinued, and there was a very high probability that the patient would die. So Doherty hadn't gotten many calls like this. She was pretty shocked, and she concentrated on writing down every little detail. Hospital administrators were going to call the medical examiner and encourage the ME to take the case, too. So they gave Doherty the victim's name, Julie Keown, date of birth 5/16/1973.
That's our Julie.
That's Julie.
So who was calling?
It was someone from administration at the hospital.
It was this common knowledge at the hospital?
Well, I don't know if it was common knowledge, but the doctors and everyone had reported she had ethylene glycol. That's what she was dying of. Ethylene glycol poisoning.
He's suspicious.
Well, more than suspicious. She wasn't depressed. Plus, she was a nurse, so she's not going to kill herself in such an awful way, even if she was. And it couldn't be accidental. So yeah, it was very suspicious.
Right. So Doherty talked to his supervisor and told the caller that officers would be sent over. Hospital is located in Newton, but Julie had been living in Waltham, so the caller had called the Waltham police. Officers were asked to meet the caller at the medical affairs office in the hospital because the caller didn't want them to show up at the hospital unit.
Well, yeah, they didn't want the family to see the police.
Right. Caller did say that Julie's parents were suspicious and might be contacting the police themselves. Unknown to the caller, an officer was sitting in the police department's operations center taking a report in person from Julie's parents, Jack and Nancy Oldag. So they're converging all at once here, aren't they?
Yeah, Jack and Nancy were very suspicious, and they kind of snuck off to the police station to let them know what their concerns were. And their concerns were regarding James. They really appeared to be in a state of shock as they sat in the police station and spoke about their 31-year-old daughter being poisoned. They couldn't imagine how Julie could have ingested ethylene glycol, which they'd been told was the main ingredient in antifreeze.
So how's that going to get into her system?
Exactly. Right? Very unlikely. Julie had been sick for several months with what she believed was related to her kidney disease, but then things had taken a turn for the worse over that Labor Day weekend.
Yeah, you know, her kidney disease was probably handy for the person poisoning her.
I suppose, yeah.
Because you could blame things on the kidneys. Those aren't symptoms of poisoning. Those are symptoms of your kidney disease.
Well, sure, but they're going to find out about it. So it's kind of stupid.
Well, yeah, they're certainly going to find out about it.
Yeah. Yes, they are. Now, doctors in Massachusetts had diagnosed Julie with a mild form of kidney disease, the FSGS. Is that what we're calling it?
That's what I'm calling it, so I don't have to say focal segmental glomerulosclerosis.
Thank you. Now, this explained test results that showed elevated protein levels and blood in her urine during prior doctor's visits. But this pre-existing condition did not explain the much more serious kidney decline that was seen when Julie went to the hospital. And she'd been there on August 20th, 2004 and September 4th, 2004.
Yeah, right. She was admitted, discharged, and readmitted, right?
Right. And the Labor Day illness would be the fatal one.
Yes, that's the one that she didn't get discharged from.
Right. So after getting a call from their son-in-law James telling them that Julie had been admitted to the hospital and was on a respirator. Now, what parent would just want to hear that? That's horrible.
Not good to hear.
No. The Oldags had flown to Boston from Plattsburgh, Missouri. During a layover in Chicago, they'd called James to check on Julie, and he told them that she'd had a seizure and was now unresponsive. So by the time the Oldags called James from a taxi on their way to the hospital in Boston, doctors had already determined that Julie had been the victim of ethylene glycol poisoning.
So Julie's father, Jack, asked James where the antifreeze could have come from. And James told his father-in-law that over the weekend, Julie had gone missing, and he couldn't find her anywhere in the house. When he'd gone outside to check the yard, he'd seen Julie walking back towards the house. And James said that he had asked her where she'd been, and she told him she'd gone for a walk because it made her feel better. James claimed to have no idea where the antifreeze had come from. Julie's parents just wanted to find out what had happened to Julie, and they couldn't understand how this had happened.
No, it makes no sense.
Well, it makes no sense, plus his explanation is a non-explanation.
Right. Well, and he'll add to that, but it's totally incredible.
He's got to work on building up his story.
Yeah, it's not a good one.
No.
Now, at the hospital, police officers learned that Julie had been brought to the hospital 3 days earlier, Saturday, September 4th, just after 9 p.m. A blood sample had been taken in the ER, and she'd tested positive for ethylene glycol. So about 30 cc's could be enough to kill an adult. A smaller dose of the poison would make someone act like she was intoxicated. And of course it would also cause kidney damage, which would match Julie's symptoms. So while they waited for James to sign a release for Julie's medical records, police officers discussed how the ethylene glycol could have ended up in Julie's system. Could it have been a suicide attempt? Could the couple have gone out to dinner and maybe she ingested the poison accidentally? And then it only took them a few moments before they got to the point where they asked about Julie's husband.
There's only so many questions that you can ask about the ethylene glycol before you're going to be looking at him.
Yeah, he's the only one that lives with her.
So just after 3 o'clock p.m. that day, James signed off on a release giving the hospital permission to brief the detectives on Julie's doctor reports, lab reports, and nursing notes. James said he wanted to speak with the detectives himself. Also, a hospital representative told the detectives that James Keown had brought his wife into the emergency room on Saturday night in a wheelchair. Julie had slurred speech and her balance was off, so she couldn't walk. On an earlier trip to the hospital, which was 2 weeks previously, Julie's potassium levels were very elevated. High potassium can be a sign of kidney failure, and we know that Julie was dealing with kidney disease. But her symptoms were severe and life-threatening at this point, certainly not consistent with the mild side effects that her disease might have caused. What's more, her blood pressure was dangerously elevated. I would say dangerously elevated.
Oh, absolutely.
237/132. That's huge. And her pulse was 120. She couldn't move her arms or legs, and she was only able to nod her head yes or no in answering questions.
So this woman was very sick. Very sick.
That blood pressure needs to be brought down.
Yes. Well, when she was in the ER, she was given a dose of Narcan, a drug often given to people who overdose on opiates. This works by counteracting life-threatening depression of the central nervous system and the respiratory system.
Well, the other thing with Narcan is there's virtually no side effects, so it
doesn't hurt.
It's perfectly safe to give without worrying about reactions to it.
Well, that's why it's so important that it be easy for people to get, especially people with drug problems. Could save lives, and it's not going to hurt anything.
It could, and it does.
Yep. Now, Julie was also given 10 milligrams of labetalol to stabilize the blood pressure and bicarbonate of soda because her initial toxicology screen showed that she had metabolic acidosis.
Yeah, so the bicarbonate is to balance the low pH from the acidosis. That'll make things better that way. And the blood pressure, I don't know, 10 milligrams of labetalol? That might be just an initial dose, huh?
Maybe, but I think if it's IV, it'd probably use a lower dose and get a higher effect.
I'm assuming that's IV.
Of course.
She wasn't awake enough to swallow.
Exactly.
And bicarb, you're going to give IV.
She's seriously ill. It's not like you're walking in and saying, here, take this pill. She was in bad shape.
Yeah. Well, the condition was critical enough. She was intubated because of not breathing well. And she's also given some Ativan to relax her muscles.
Which is normal when you're intubating someone. You need to relax.
Them a little bit so she's not pulling on the tube or things like that. And the ER doctor also noted that Julie seemed to be unresponsive to pain. That's definitely not a good sign. James told them that his wife had been treated on September 2nd for nausea and was undergoing treatment for renal insufficiency. James said Julie had not consumed any alcohol, and she did not use any drugs, and she had no psychiatric history.
Now, she was a pretty happy woman, and now she's pretty much dying. So Dr. Brian Minsk had been treating Julie for 2 months for nausea and vomiting. Julie had not been dizzy or unsteady on her feet, as she'd been when she came to the ER on September 4th. Dr. Mintz had diagnosed Julie with esophagitis, an inflammation of the esophagus that is usually caused by gastroesophageal reflux disease. And he had prescribed steroids because of the autoimmune disease and referred her to a nephrologist. So that's what they're thinking, is maybe it's autoimmune, before she came in dying. Hospital intern Dr. Kevin Rakins told Waltham detectives that he had a bad feeling about Julie's illness. He also said he found the behavior of James Keown suspicious. Rankins had met Julie and her husband James on August 20th, 2004 when she was admitted, and her speech had been slurred and she had been dizzy. James had been extremely friendly and had gone out of his way to offer Rankins information about Julie's symptoms. Rankins did notice that James had answered most of the questions for Julie, not really giving her a chance to speak, because on that admission she could speak. Rankins thought about the warning signs he had been taught to look for, and then he started to wonder if maybe Julie was the victim of domestic violence. And poisoning your spouse would be domestic violence, attempted murder.
Certainly would.
So Rankins had checked in on Julie every day for the next 3 days, and she always asked him about her lab tests, and Rankins would explain the results to her. Julie was very concerned about getting healthy again, and with her medical knowledge, she was a very proactive patient. But her husband James also seemed very engaged. He sat by her bedside like any loving husband would do. But still, Rankins couldn't overcome this feeling of just great unease when Julie first came into the hospital. Although he didn't know that James was a bad guy, hospital protocol was that he had to ask Julie if she was safe at home.
And one day while James was out of the room, Rankins approached Julie and asked her about feeling safe at home. Julie looked shocked, and she immediately assured him that she felt very safe with her husband. James walked back in the room right then, and Julie turned to him and said, "Kevin just asked me if you beat me." And she said this with some laughter. And then James laughed, and then Rankins laughed too. But he had a very uneasy feeling. For one thing, he didn't like the way James had tried to control the situation and answer questions for Julie.
Yeah, that's not a good sign.
Oh, he deflected nicely.
Very controlling.
Rankins continued to check in on Julie, and she always wanted to know about her condition and if she was improving. James also spoke to Rankins alone a few times, and he seemed to be at a loss for what could be wrong with Julie. He told Rankins that in their 11 years together, she had only been sick a total of 3 times. It's a healthy woman.
Well, she's young. She should be healthy, right?
Yeah, she's late 20s, early 30s during their time together, so yeah, he should be.
Yeah. Now, Julie's condition stabilized during that earlier admission. She was discharged from the hospital and put under the care of a kidney specialist. Rankins called Julie a week later to find out how she was doing, and James answered the phone. "Oh, hey, Kevin, Julie's in the shower," he said, "but I'm glad you called." And then he did pass the phone to Julie, who told Rankins that she still wasn't feeling very well. Now, Rankins suggested that she call her primary care doctor to have some new blood work done. Julie emailed Rankins later to let him know that she had followed up with her regular doctor, and then he had been relieved. But then, on the morning of September 5th, less than 1 week later, he saw James back in the hospital. Rankins went up to James and asked him what was going on with Julie, and James told him that on Friday, September 3rd, she'd seemed just fine. She'd gone for a walk or two outside, and they had gone out to dinner that evening. But then on Saturday morning, Julie was tired, and she stayed in bed all morning. She felt dizzy every time she tried to get up. And at around noon, she did get out of bed, and James went out to buy donuts at a store just around the corner from their apartment. A few hours later, James said, Julie said she wanted a Sprite, and James went back to buy some for her. A few hours later, Julie had to use the bathroom, but told James she wasn't sure that she could walk there herself. So as Rankins was listening to James' story of why Julie was back in the hospital, his pager went off. There was a code blue, and it was in Julie's room. So James sat and watched as Rankins ran toward Julie's room, but he didn't even follow him. Now most family members would try and be in there, but he didn't. And after Julie was stabilized, Rankins walked back to James, who was sitting outside in the hallway. James looked like he was crying, and he looked up and asked if Julie was still alive. Rankins nodded yes, and then he sat with James for about 3 hours, just leaving periodically to check on Julie's condition. Although Julie had been stabilized, her kidneys were actually shutting down now. She was in a coma, and the prognosis was really bad. Rankins did note that it was strange that James wasn't asking him for any details about his wife's condition. He actually seemed content to sit and talk about sports during that time.
Yeah, guy stuff.
So that's really weird.
Yeah, it is.
Most spouses would be devastated.
Rankins left James around 2 o'clock that afternoon, but then he saw him again 9 o'clock that night. He was in Julie's room eating a sandwich. Now, at this point, Rankins knew that the latest tests on Julie had shown that she had ethylene glycol poisoning, and James apparently knew this too. On Monday morning, September 6th, Rankins returned to check on Julie again. This time, James was with Julie's parents, Jack and Nancy, and Julie's best friend, Heather. James went over to Rankins and hugged him. He seemed happy to see him. But Julie's parents and friend immediately began asking Rankins questions about ethylene glycol poisoning.
So their behavior, to me, is more normal.
Yeah, they got there as soon as they found out how critical she was. They're there, and they're asking the appropriate questions.
Yes, they're not talking sports. Nancy, Julie's mom, wanted to know if there were any household chemicals or products that might contain ethylene glycol, but Rankins explained that there really weren't. James never asked any questions that morning at all. He only spoke up to tell the group that Julie had barely drunk any of the Sprite he'd gone out to buy her on Saturday. He claimed that he had drunk most of it. So that was kind of weird.
Yeah, what's with that? Is it that they're going to be investigating ethylene glycol poisoning? Is this an alibi for himself? There wasn't anything in the Sprite because he drank it and he's fine.
Right.
I don't know.
It's pretty lame.
It is. So, and then the next morning, Rankins met with James again at the hospital. And again, James hugged him, and then he introduced him to a friend, Ted Willimore. And this guy is a ER doc. "You're amazing," James told Rankins that morning. And all that day, James repeated this to the group of family and friends who had gathered to be by Julie's side. Now, this made Rankins moderately uncomfortable. It was over the top and just seemed inappropriate. Maybe one time say that, but not every time you meet people.
Well, that's not what he should be thinking about.
No.
He should not care about that at all. His mind should be on his wife if he really loved her and was concerned. But it seems like he's more like putting on a show for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And later that day, James approached Rankins in the hallway and asked him what the hospital's role was in determining his wife's cause of death.
So hang on a second. What do you think about that?
Now, I was just going to say to you, I wasn't aware she had died.
No, she hadn't.
So,
Rankins was really taken aback because Julie was still alive. But he talked to James. He told James that they could do an autopsy. Then James asked if the hospital's decision would be the end of it, if they determined that her death was an accident. So how weird is that?
yeah, he's looking for those answers, right?
Well, Rankins was really bothered by these questions, and his uneasiness with James was just growing and growing. Nancy had seen her daughter just 2 weeks earlier, shortly after she'd been discharged from the hospital the first time. She and her husband Jack had flown from their Missouri farm after learning about Julie's kidney disease. They were told then that Julie would eventually need a kidney transplant. During that trip, they'd all done some sightseeing, and James had driven them by Harvard University and pointed out the building where he attended classes. And later, they stopped at the bookstore. And guess what James bought them for gifts? T-shirts that read, "My son attends Harvard." How gross is that? I just think that's gross.
Well, if you look at the context of things, here his wife is critically ill, dying even, and he's buying T-shirts.
Well, just learning that she'd need a kidney transplant eventually is very disturbing news. It's not something you just say, let's go sightseeing.
Right.
It was weird. So when Nancy last saw her daughter, she told the police Julie had seemed tired and had a low-grade fever. And Julie had expressed concern about what an impact a transplant and dialysis might have on her plans to get pregnant. Her doctor told her that if she did get pregnant, it would be a high-risk pregnancy. And that's what you said. But not impossible. No. She actually had a friend who'd gone through it with a similar disease and had a baby. So she was really, looking into it. It was important to her.
Yeah, and when all things being equal, it wasn't going to be an easy pregnancy. It's going to be very difficult. But she wanted to.
She really wanted to, yeah.
So the detectives asked Nancy about Julie's and James's relationship. Nancy said that they seemed to be very supportive and respectful of each other. She added that they had only been in the States since January. James was not only attending classes at Harvard, but he had continued working for the Learning Exchange. The company had allowed him to keep his job because he had convinced them that his studies at Harvard would help him perform his marketing job even better. Nancy didn't know of any friends he had made during his classes there.
No, and Julie hadn't met anyone from there either.
So this whole Harvard thing was a vacuum. Nobody knew except for James what was going on with Harvard.
Exactly. So as the detectives were finishing their interview, Nancy told them that there was something else she thought that they should know. James and Julie had fought because James couldn't keep a job. Nancy said that James changed jobs every couple of years, and the move to Waltham had not been Julie's idea. Julie, her mother said, didn't want to move there. Nancy said that James had worked in radio when he and Julie were first married, and then he had gone on to building websites. In Chicago, he'd worked for ESPN, but he quit that job. Then he worked for Susquehanna Radio in Kansas City, but then his job was eliminated. So he appeared to have gotten out of radio when he took his current marketing job at the Learning Exchange. But Julie had recently learned that James had an interview with WRKO in Boston.
Julie's father, Jack, also spoke with the detectives, and he had much more to say about how his daughter could have been poisoned. Although it tasted sweet, drinking antifreeze would be an extremely painful and prolonged way to kill oneself. And as a nurse, Julie would have had access to many medications. That would have been a painless and faster way to take her own life. Besides, he said, Julie had no reason to want to die. She was very much looking forward to her future.
And that was the consensus. Julie was looking forward to her future.
Yes.
I mean, that's how we opened the episode, talking about what she wanted to accomplish.
Right.
Jack believed that Julie and James had been putting $1,500 a month into savings, so he thought money was a very unlikely motive for murder. They had moved to Boston because James had a full scholarship to Harvard.
Or so he said.
That's what he said. Now, Jack affirmed his wife's statement that Julie rarely got sick. The only thing he could remember was a UTI she'd had about 10 years ago. But something else was bothering Jack, and he brought that up. One of the doctors taking care of his daughter had told Nancy and Jack that James had called the hospital at 11 a.m. that Saturday about Julie's deteriorating condition. He'd spoken to the doctor, and the doctor had told James to bring her to the hospital immediately. But when had he brought her in? 9 o'clock that night. So he'd waited 10 hours.
Bit of a delay.
Yes. So Jack said if my daughter didn't do this to herself, statistically, it had to be my son-in-law.
Well, yeah. There's two of them in the apartment. And if it's not the one, it's the other.
Right.
Right?
Yes. Now, the other thing that Jack brought up was that James had told Nancy and Jack that Julie had gone out for a walk on Saturday night. James said that he had scolded Julie for leaving the house without telling him. But James thought that there was the possibility. Now, you gotta listen to this. There was the possibility that somebody had cleaned out their radiator and put the old antifreeze in a soda bottle. James also suggested that because Julie was taking the prescription drug prednisone, which made her spaced out and not completely coherent, she may have picked up that bottle of discarded antifreeze and taken a drink out of it on her walk.
Okay.
That's some bullshit.
There's so many things wrong with that discussion.
Yeah, let's go over it a little.
Okay, so first you're suggesting that somebody cleaned out a radiator and just left this old antifreeze in containers on the street.
Yeah, in like a soda bottle or Gatorade bottle.
So that wouldn't have been done. They would have been packed into a container or something.
Okay, but let's just say that happened. Let's give him that. Okay?
So we'll say that.
There's a lot more wrong.
So then Julie's walking along and sees him and says, "Oh, I'm thirsty. I think I'll take one."
Right.
And take a drink out of discarded trash.
Yeah.
At the curbside.
Right, exactly.
No way.
No way. And what about prednisone? It can make you a little hyper or something, but it doesn't make you incoherent.
No.
No. So it was just so far-fetched and so unlikely. And, you know, even Nancy and Jack with no medical knowledge knew that this was just ridiculous.
And to me, it would make me more suspicious of the guy.
Of course, he's trying to come up with ways that she could have gotten it besides from him.
Yeah.
It's so obvious.
Comes up with this totally cockamamie story that instead of deflecting suspicion, directs it back to him.
Oh, he would have been a lot better off just saying nothing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this raised a lot of eyebrows.
I'll bet. Then James had called Julie's parents Saturday about 11 o'clock at night, Central Time, to tell them that he'd taken Julie to the hospital and that she was on a breathing tube. Then, Sunday morning, James called them again, and this time he told them that Julie was unconscious. By 7 o'clock Sunday evening, Nancy and Jack were landing at Logan Airport in Boston. James had offered to pick them up. Now, why would he volunteer to leave his critically ill wife to go to the airport?
Crazy.
Why hadn't he just told him to call a taxi?
Exactly.
And geez.
That's really weird, too.
And when detectives spoke with Julie's brother Chad, who was an auto mechanic, and he said he was familiar with ethylene glycol, and there was no way someone would ingest it willingly, according to Chad. And he didn't know of any problems between the couple.
Well, that seemed to be the problem with the investigation in the beginning, is everything just seemed so wonderful between them to the outside. Yeah. If you didn't really know them well, they just seemed great.
So there wasn't anything that raised suspicions. Everybody said, oh, what a great couple.
Yeah, not until the poisoning itself, there weren't a lot of suspicions. So detectives delved further into James's story of Julie going out on a walk on Saturday. James had told Nancy that it was after dark on Saturday and that he hadn't known where she was. He claimed he went out looking for her, and then when he came back to the front of the house, he found her walking back toward home. But Nancy had spoken with James 3 times that Saturday, and during the first call, he told Nancy that Julie was in bed and not feeling well. Then around noon, James had called Nancy to tell her that Julie was really tired and in bed sleeping. He said he wanted to take her to the hospital, but Julie refused. Now Nancy was worried, but at that point she still felt that her daughter was in good hands with James. She felt like he loved her daughter and would take the best care of her. Then the third phone call to Nancy and Jack from James, coming in at about 11 p.m., was when James had taken Julie to the hospital where she was having blood tests done. At this point, Julie was dizzy and couldn't even talk. Her body was basically limp. She had been carrying on a conversation on the way to the hospital, James said, but he said he hadn't been able to make out what she was saying.
There was also one other thing that was bothering Nancy and Jack about James. James told Nancy that it would be okay to bury Julie in Missouri because he probably wasn't going to stay in Boston long term. Now, the only problem was when he said this, Julie wasn't dead.
No.
Well, he just can't make up his mind as whether she's alive or dead.
I think he's just anxious for her to be dead, is the horrible truth of it. It's horrible to think about, but I think that's the case. So when James was interviewed by detectives, he gave permission for them to look inside the duplex where they'd been living. They wanted to see if there was anything there that might be connected to Julie's poisoning. But James told them he couldn't go to the duplex with the police because he had to stay with his wife. So then he finally agreed to send a friend in his place, and that would be his friend Ted Willimore, the ER doctor. Ted had arrived in Boston after learning about Julie's condition, and he and his wife had been pretty good friends with Julie and James. So Ted met several detectives at the door of the duplex. Ted had known James and Julie since college. His wife Layla was one of Julie's best friends. Now Ted understood how serious ethylene glycol poisoning was for Julie. He explained that a person would have to ingest a lot of that to die. But as they were speaking inside of the duplex, who showed up but James? Just turned up there. So his wife is near death in the hospital, but now he suddenly shows up at the duplex. So that was weird, but they just kind of tried to ignore him and talk to Ted. So Ted walked up to the third floor of the duplex where the couple had their home office. He offered to log into a medical site and show the detective some information about ethylene glycol. But after trying to log on to James's computer, Ted turned to the detective and he said the computer wasn't working. So the two looked closer at these computers in the room and they noticed there's no towers or hard drives connected to the monitors. So this was at a point where computers had to have the towers underneath, right? That's the computer system.
Yeah, early
But those
2000s.
those are gone. Those have been taken away.
Yeah.
Wires were hanging down from the back of the monitors. This was so odd.
So you had monitors that were unattached to anything.
Right. And this is especially odd because both James and Julie had been working from home. So why?
Well, they weren't working on those computers.
Well, they should have been. Somebody had taken them.
Or he had taken them, James had done something to them because it had information.
Absolutely. I think that was totally it. Why else would he? It's very suspicious. Now, other investigators at the duplex were collecting potential evidence, and they took several items, including an empty Sprite bottle that they found out on the back deck. But no antifreeze was found anywhere in the home.
Ted was anxious to speak with the detectives alone, and he agreed to go to the police station with them for an interview. So in a conference room at the police station, Ted told the detectives that he and his wife had recently taken a trip with the Keowns and another couple. The three couples had gone together to Sunset Beach, North Carolina, back in August. They did have to cut the vacation short because of a hurricane warning where they were staying. During one of the conversations with their old girlfriends on this trip, Julie had commented that she was so excited that they had all married well and gone on to have successful lives and careers.
Now, doesn't that make you sad that she said that? It's just
Yeah,
horrible.
It does.
It's really sad.
Now, Julie was ill at the time, and she napped during the trip, but she did seem to have a normal appetite, according to Ted. And on the trip, Ted said James had said he needed a new job. He wanted to start his own company, but he needed some capital to start it up. Now, before this trip, James was supposed to mail Ted a check for $700 to cover his and Julie's part of the trip expenses. But Ted never got a check. Then when they got together, James told Ted that he had mailed the check, and he wrote him another one for $540. But that check bounced. Ted decided to let the issue go because of Julie's medical issues and her friendship with his wife. So he thought that the Keowns had financial issues that Julie did not know about.
Well,
Right.
yeah, what else would you gather from that information? But at this point, Ted didn't necessarily suspect James of poisoning Julie. But when he went over the possibilities with the detectives, they all decided that it had to be a murder. Despite James Keown's lack of emotion for his wife, everyone told detectives that he was a really nice guy. There was no history of domestic violence, and he didn't fit the profile of a killer. He may have been in shock. But as investigators looked more closely into James's life and finances, he did become the prime suspect in Julie's murder. Detectives were quickly becoming convinced that James was responsible. On September 8th, they called both the Kansas City and Liberty, Missouri police departments to find out if there was any reported history of domestic violence between James and Julie. There wasn't, but that didn't necessarily mean that it didn't exist. Victims often keep abuse to themselves. Still, everyone who they'd talked to so far had described a very loving relationship between the two.
Yeah, but despite the fact that Julie would be dead by the end of that day, James had found enough time to call the state police and tell one investigator that he'd remembered Julie talking about whether it hurt when you die. And after that, James claimed she had bought 250 milliliters of chloroform, bought it online that past May. He said he wasn't sure she'd ever received the chloroform, but he wanted investigators to be aware of that fact.
Oh my God. He's just so desperate.
Yeah.
At this point, I think maybe he's getting worried that he's in trouble.
I think he is.
Because that's a really lame thing.
And then later that day, James again left his wife at the hospital in order to meet a detective at his Waltham duplex and give him 2 laptops that Julie had used in the past. 2 hours later, Julie was pronounced dead.
So sad. So the medical examiner completed an autopsy on Julie on September 9th. She wrote that Julie had suffered from kidney failure as a result of ingesting ethylene glycol. It was both an acute and a chronic poisoning, meaning she'd been given several doses over several weeks or even months, and then that fatal dose that fall. There was scar tissue on her kidneys. Julie's doctors had initially thought that she might have been suffering from an autoimmune disease and they'd put her on steroids. The medical examiner said she didn't believe the ethylene glycol poisoning was self-induced because it would have been too painful to continue for such a long period of time. Why would anyone do that to themselves?
No, everything I've read about ethylene glycol, it's not a very good way to kill yourself.
Oh my God, it sounds horrible. It sounds like you really suffer.
It does.
Pain, hallucinations, just miserable. Now, Julie likely would have become inebriated, like someone who's very drunk, which was out of character for her, who rarely drank any alcohol. As the poison invaded her body, Julie may have vomited and become nauseated. Her body then went into metabolic acidosis and she suffered from central nervous system depression, meaning it would slow down her breathing. The amount of ethylene glycol she ingested before her death, however, was enough to put her into a coma, and this was a painfully slow way to die. So now let's get into some of what's going on behind the scenes here with the money and the jobs and all that stuff.
Okay, because once you start looking at this, you're going to see how quickly things unravel for James.
Exactly, yes.
So police spoke with the Keown's landlord, who lived on one side of the duplex, and rented out the other side to Julie and James. Julie and James had a lease that ended in July of 2005. The rent was $2,000 per month.
That's a lot.
Yeah, this is
Especially,
over 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Of course, any place around Boston's expensive.
Yes, it's a very expensive area to live in.
So when they moved in, they had to put down $4,000, first month, last month. The landlord had actually been concerned that the couple didn't make enough money to afford the place. But James said, don't worry. He told him that the company he worked for in Missouri, the Learning Exchange, was going to pay his rent. James said that he would be working remotely while he attended Harvard.
Yeah, but James hadn't been paying his rent, it turns out. The rent check that James sent on July 1st, 2004 had bounced. The next check he sent on July 10th also bounced. James was apologetic and he claimed that he was having a problem with his bank in Kansas City. James eventually handed over a personal check that did clear for the July rent. But then in August, 3 rent checks bounced. Finally, a cashier's check cleared. But the rent problems didn't end there. Just the week before Julie was hospitalized, James had confided to the landlord that he and Julie were having financial issues. Of course, Julie had no idea.
None whatsoever.
So, James asked if the landlord would allow them to use their last month's rent deposit towards their September rent. And because the landlord knew that Julie was having some serious health problems and he felt sorry for her, he agreed to that. But James never did give an explanation for why his company wasn't paying the rent for him like he'd said they would.
Well, he made payments for what, 4 or 5 months?
Yeah.
And then that was it.
Well, yeah, and he'd actually presented a false document from the company he was supposedly working for, saying that they agreed to pay the rent.
Yeah, right. Now, in a search of the duplex on September 8th, investigators found a large supply of Gatorade and empty Gatorade bottles. Now, the strange thing about this was that Julie didn't even like Gatorade. In fact, a friend of Julie's would tell detectives that she had been on the phone with Julie when she overheard James telling her to drink her Gatorade, and Julie had laughed and said that James kept insisting that she drink it.
Uh-huh. Well, Julie's friend, Christina Lyles, had been worrying about Julie that September. She'd called her several times with no response. She'd then left messages on James's phone. When she finally got him to answer a call, he claimed that he had called her back several times. But she knew this wasn't true. There was no record of a call from James on her phone. But that was not first in Christina's mind when James told her that they had lost Julie. James went on to calmly explain to her that Julie had slipped into a coma and died. So a voice in Christina's mind seemed to tell her that this wasn't the real story. She started to think back to what she knew about James and Julie's relationship. And for her, some things never seemed to make sense. And that went for her husband as well. The expensive cars the couple drove, the nice home they were able to afford, and the expensive hotels they stayed in during visits back to Kansas City after they'd moved to Boston. Then she remembered the story that James had told her husband Dave about his job at the Learning Exchange. James had told Dave that he was a government employee with the Learning Exchange, which was actually part of Homeland Security. Now that was a blatant lie. In truth, the Learning Exchange was a non-profit educational company that developed educational programs for students in the Kansas City region. James's job had absolutely nothing to do with Homeland Security. So when Christina had tried to call James back a few days after the conversation about Julie's death, his phone was disconnected. So something seemed really off to Christina. So the next day she called the Waltham Police Department. She told them there's no way Julie did this, and she was crying. She explained that Julie had been working from her home since she and James had moved to Waltham. Christina and Julie had kept in touch by email and phone calls after the move, but it seemed that Christina was usually the one who had to initiate contact. On August 30th, Christina had even asked Julie if someone could be poisoning her. Julie had answered that wasn't possible because she and James were eating the same food and he was perfectly fine. "I feel like I'm going to fall over," Julie said to her one day, adding that James was just so good to her. He'd pick her up when she had a spell in the bathroom and he'd take care of her. He'd rubbed her hair and encouraged her to drink fluids to get better. Just the ideal husband.
And there were other things about James that were concerning to Christina. Like there was a time when Julie had called her with some shocking news. "You're not going to believe what happened to James," Julie told Christina in January of 2004. James had been working late at the Learning Exchange, and when he went to leave, he saw a man in the parking lot with a crowbar. The man told James he was having car trouble and asked for help. And then when James went to help him, the guy beat him up and stole his wallet. Now, Christina knew that the Learning Exchange wasn't in the best part of town, but she was still surprised by the story.
Well, and it'll turn out that there was no police report. So that seems like it was totally made up.
Other things I thought about, James had been on crutches at Christina's wedding. And then another time he'd been hurt falling out of the attic. How do you do that?
I don't know.
Never mind. And when she told her husband the story, they had agreed that it was weird that James kept getting injured so often. And not just getting injured, but having these fantastical stories about how the injuries had occurred.
Well, I have to tell you about the wallet thing. I think it's just because he didn't have money he was supposed to have because he was lying.
Yeah.
So if he tells his wife that his wallet was stolen,
yeah, then
that money can be missing and it's not his fault.
Right.
And she was just too trusting to check up on him and make sure he'd let the police know or anything. She trusted him. But Christina said she'd never believed that James had been attacked. She thought that he'd actually made this up to prompt Julie to agree to move to Boston, because this was right before they moved. Before they moved to Waltham, James and Julie had lived in this nice split-level home in a suburb of Kansas City. He drove a Jaguar, and she drove a Ford Expedition. Christina and Dave had always wondered how the couple, who made about the same income as they did, afforded that lifestyle. The Jaguar was something James had purchased with an inheritance he had received, Julie once explained to Christina. But James had told Dave that the car had actually been given to him by a dealership, Aristocrat Motors, in exchange for him designing a website for them. Now, I don't really need to say it, but that wasn't true either.
Well, I think you need to get your story straight.
Exactly.
You know. Then another time, Julie told Christina about a lawsuit James had against a company he used to work for. The company refused to pay James for company items he'd purchased on his personal credit card.
Well, I mean, that's just probably a way for him to explain why he has a big credit card bill.
Right. So Christina had found this story hard to believe, but she was thinking a lot of James's stories were hard to believe. but she didn't say anything to anybody. But now, Christina decided it was time to do some checking up on James. And then when she looked into local court records, she found that a credit card company was suing him for over $8,000. And she also learned that the Jaguar car dealership in Merriam, Kansas, was trying to repossess the Jag from James.
Yeah, so Christina was feeling very suspicious about James, and the suspicions continued to grow the more she found out. She and her husband saw James when they walked into the viewing reception the day before Julie's funeral service. Now he'd seen Christina, but then he quickly turned away. So she walked over to him and offered her condolences with tears in her eyes. James thanked her, but then he promptly walked away, which seemed really odd. So she watched as James walked around greeting people and shaking hands, thinking he looked more like he was at a party than at the memorial for his wife.
Yeah, he's working the crowd.
Now the next day after the funeral, the pallbearers began to carry the casket down the aisle, and James stood to walk behind his wife. But he had a big smile on his face as he walked, and he stopped to shake hands with mourners. Christina felt absolutely sick. To her, James looked almost relieved that Julie was gone, and then she was convinced that he had killed her. But after the funeral, James called Christina. She didn't want to reveal what she'd been thinking about him. He told her that he was planning to move back to Kansas City, but he wasn't sure when. He told her that he would contact her after he got settled there. Christina found it strange that James wanted to move back to Kansas City so soon after Julie's death, especially because during a previous conversation, he told her that he planned to stay in Boston and finish up his studies at Harvard. So what happened to that?
James told Christina that he did not have confidence in the police who were investigating Julie's case. According to James, there was a lot of corruption among the police in Middlesex County, and 2 policemen were being sent to jail. Then the medical examiner was no better, he told Christina. The ME had been accused of not conducting thorough autopsies. He said he actually had to ask the hospital to do an autopsy on Julie because they weren't going to do one.
Oh.
That's got to be complete bullshit.
That's total bullshit.
You have a death by poisoning?
Of a 31-year-old.
Yeah, they're sure as hell going to do an autopsy.
And why would he think that woman would believe it? He thinks people are stupid.
Yeah. Now, James felt like the hospital should have found the ethylene glycol in Julie's system during a dizzy episode she'd had 2 weeks before her death. James said he wanted to hire his own private medical examiner to do another autopsy, and he had already hired his own attorney.
Yeah, because he has so much money.
Yep.
Christina was still looking for answers, and she asked James if Julie had been depressed at all. No, he began, but then he paused and he added, well, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe she was. James said that he suspected that Julie was depressed because of a conversation that he'd had with Ted's wife, Layla Willimore. He said that Layla told him that Julie seemed depressed to her, and that the Thursday before Labor Day weekend, Julie had been extremely upset during a phone call. So Julie reportedly told Layla, if God is going to let this happen to me, then fuck God. But Christina had never heard Julie talk like that. And Layla didn't say anything to the police about Julie having depression during their interview with her. So the police told James that he and Layla were giving them conflicting statements.
Yeah, and Christina just didn't accept James's claim that Julie had been depressed. Why would Julie do that to herself? Christina asked. And the answer was simple, James said. Julie didn't want to be a burden to anyone because of her kidney failure, and she was afraid that she had something worse wrong with her, like a cancer.
But just him saying these things make him look more guilty, and he doesn't get it. Waltham detectives heard from Nancy and Jack on an almost daily basis after Julie died. One day, Jack remembered that James had given him 2 bottles of antifreeze before he and Julie left for Boston. James had told him at the time that he didn't need them anymore, which was really odd because the Boston winters were colder than those in Kansas City. Nancy pointed out that Julie had a yellow legal pad which she'd carried around with her when she got sick. She'd used it to write down questions about her illness. So Nancy wondered, why would she go to all that trouble if she was taking the poison voluntarily? That didn't make any sense.
Yeah, and although she'd had some reservations about the move, Julie seemed happy in Waltham, according to Nancy. The move had turned out better than she'd expected, and she said that she and James were saving $1,500 a month. Now, Nancy found this hard to believe because James hadn't had enough money to pay for Julie's funeral. And by then, detectives knew that James and Julie hadn't been saving any money, but were actually very deeply in debt. In addition to the bounced rent checks, their bank accounts had negative balances. They also had $20,000 in credit card bills. Now, that kind of debt didn't make a lot of sense for a couple who both had good jobs.
Yeah, during one phone call with her, Nancy said Julie had confided to her that James was applying for a job with the local radio station. Now, even though James had once promised Julie that he wouldn't return to radio, Julie was happy about this because she said she didn't think his job with the Learning Exchange was going very well. Jack said that he didn't think that James was still working for the Learning Exchange anyway, because the company hadn't sent any flowers to Julie's funeral.
Huh.
That was pretty good for him to pick up on that.
That's a good observation, isn't it?
Yeah. And then James stopped cooperating with the police. He hired a lawyer after his most recent meeting with the Massachusetts State Police. And the police weren't the only ones with whom James had stopped talking. Nancy wondered if James's lawyer had told him not to speak with his in-laws anymore, so as not to incriminate himself. James had become more withdrawn, and he was not returning her phone calls. And Nancy felt like James was hiding something.
Now, James abandoned his duplex in Waltham in late 2004. He left personal things and computer equipment behind, but he took his Sony Vaio laptop with him. James had not notified his landlord, and he left behind thousands of dollars in household furnishings and electronics. All very strange.
Yeah, that's probably stuff he'd bought with the credit cards. That's why the credit card debt. And then to just leave it there and move, it's really weird.
And maybe he thought that the place would retake him and not make him pay for it.
Well, in what world would that happen? That's not how it works, Diggy.
Really?
Really.
Okay. So I have to take the car back?
Yeah, usually you have to return that stuff. Now, Tammy Blossom of the Learning Exchange had hired James back in 2002. To start up the consulting department, the company wanted to launch an interactive website and needed someone to work on developing that site, as well as a business plan to market the consulting component. So when she met James Keown, he was well dressed in a suit that must have cost close to $1,000, and he wore shoes that she knew cost hundreds of dollars. James was exceptional at selling himself to Blossom and the others at the company. He spent close to 15 minutes giving this very enthusiastic and in-depth explanation of the work he'd been doing in Chicago when he worked for ESPN. Although James had actually had a very minor job at that radio station, he embellished his experience to fit exactly with the job requirements for his web-based marketing position at the Learning Exchange. But in actuality, he'd only been an assistant. Still, he easily discussed how he had led this ESPN project. He gave details that included knowledge of the software program that the Learning Exchange was using. So to those in that interview, James seemed like the ideal candidate for the new position. Despite all of this, Tammy Blossom and the company's HR director wondered why someone with James's experience, which he claimed included jobs with six-figure salaries, would want to work for a nonprofit for a lot less money. But James was able to convince them to hire him by saying that the events of September 11th had changed his life, and he wanted to move back to Kansas City and be near family. Now, he was not involved in any way with September 11th attacks, but it had changed his life. So Blossom bought it and thought that the company had hired this real gem of a guy.
Yeah, and then James had gone to Blossom with a plan to work remotely and get his MBA to improve his performance at the nonprofit. Blossom agreed after he came to her with an acceptance letter from the Harvard School of Business and told her that he had a full scholarship. But Blossom and her co-workers at the Learning Exchange became frustrated with his lack of progress on the interactive website he had been hired to create. He claimed he was working on it, but he never had anything to show for all his work. So Blossom then decided to call all his references, but the numbers were all disconnected. So the references had not been real, but James had put them together using multiple cell phones and changing his voice as he had on the radio.
This guy has some real nerve.
I'll tell you. Blossom also faxed a copy of James's Harvard acceptance letter to the director of admissions at Harvard. When she got a call from the dean of the business school, she learned that not only was James not a student at Harvard, but the letter James had provided was a fraud. The dean insisted that she had not signed or sent the letter, and she had never even heard of James Keown. Virtually everything James had told her was a lie, so he's immediately fired. After further interviews with former friends and acquaintances, detectives learned that James had not graduated from William Jewell College, as he claimed. He had dropped out to work at the local radio station.
Yeah, James told a different version of events to every person he spoke with, even about his move back to Missouri. But there was one common theme. James was always trying to keep up with the lifestyle of his more affluent friends. Robert Patterson, who had known James since college, described him as trying to keep up with the Joneses. In Kansas City, entrepreneur Tim Traben was ready to expand his business. Now, in addition to a printing business, he ran a large ranch several hours outside of the city. But he was looking for another business to grow. So he started Traben Solutions in 1998 with a partner and a small team of developers. By the fall of 2004, the custom software company had developed a product for human resources management. So Traben needed a marketing person to take it to the next level. Then the resume for James Keown showed up in his email inbox. James sounded almost too good to be true. He stated that he was relocating to Kansas City, and he listed his qualifications. He included his impressive education, too, including his current work at Harvard University, where he said that he was specializing in cutting-edge HR principles and technology law.
And in person, James appeared to be just as impressive. Traben hired him, and the company paid over $9,000 to move him to Kansas City. He had been staying with a friend in town, but James moved to an expensive loft that he rented in Kansas City. Traben began to see some odd behavior with James, but he felt sorry for him since he had recently lost his wife, and he tried not to judge him too quickly. But then one day someone who Traben knew called and told him that his new hire was not who he was portraying himself to be. So he decided to do a quick Google search on James Keown. Now, if we're in Google searches, why did he do this after the fact? Why didn't he do this before he hired the guy?
I know, he probably should have, but I think he was able to win people over and convince people pretty easily.
Yeah.
But yeah, he didn't do due diligence, obviously, and he would regret that.
So a marketing company press release came up on the search results with James Keown listed as the contact person. That company had not been listed on James's resume, and Traben thought this was kind of strange. He called the company and asked for the owner. "Listen, I got him working for me right now. Is there something I need to know?" Traben asked. "You should call this number," he told Traben, and gave him a phone number.
Yeah, when Traben called the number, he got a voicemail for a detective at the Waltham Police Department. So that really was alarming. He called back the man who had given him the detective's phone number. "Something's going on here," he said to the man. "I've got employees here. I don't need some kind of incident." But the man wouldn't say too much. He just said, "I really can't talk about a whole lot, but he's under suspicion for a pretty bad crime. And the detectives from Massachusetts are watching him." So Traben now had the feeling that James was under suspicion for murdering his wife. He called a meeting with his partners and he briefed them on what he had found out. Well, this had to be a case of mistaken identity, they told Traben. James was the ideal employee and not the type of person who would ever be tied to killing his wife. But Traben knew he had to fire him. Everything he'd told him was a lie. So Traben had a security guard in the office when he broke the news to James. James acted shocked, but he did leave without incident.
So Jill Lawson had first met Julie in August of 2003, and they had become friends. Jill knew that Julie was having health problems and had been told it was renal failure. After the trip to North Carolina in August of 2004, Julie told Jill that she felt as good as she had for a while, and Jill had spoken with James on September 5th about Julie's worsening condition. And at that time, James told her that the doctors had found ethylene glycol in Julie's system, and they were assuming she was suicidal. Jill had felt a bit disturbed by how calm, almost cold, James had sounded when he told her about Julie's prognosis. Detectives made a note of Jill Lawson's statement regarding Julie feeling better because this was the second time they had heard about Julie's symptoms improving. The other time was when Julie took the trip back to the family farm in Plattsburgh in the early summer of 2004. In both these cases, she got better when she was away from James or when she and James went out alone.
Well, that's significant.
Very significant.
And of course, other friends of Julie's were beginning to wonder about James. Ted Wilmore told detectives that James had made a statement about wearing his wedding ring until after the holidays, and then he might start dating. So Julie died in September. October, November, December. We're talking 3 or 4 months he wants to start dating. That's not appropriate, in case you were wondering.
Okay.
Just so you know, you need to wait at least a year.
Okay, that was my question. What's an appropriate time? A year.
Yeah, a year. Now, James also confided to some friends that he was going to use Julie's life insurance policy money to build a house, buy a new BMW, and then he'd start a scholarship in her name with whatever was left. James's statements about spending Julie's life insurance money also gave investigators a little more to go on in terms of the financial motive angle. But they needed more concrete proof to move forward with a murder charge. So for that, they used a computer forensic expert.
In November of 2004, after he'd been fired by Tim Trayvon, James Keown had left the expensive Kansas City loft he'd been living in and moved in with his mother in Jefferson City. He got a job with the local radio station again. He hosted a radio talk show. He had told 2 different stories about Julie's death around town. Some people he told she died of an illness. Others he said she killed herself. But James was eager to find a new wife and start a family.
Yeah, he did get himself a girlfriend. Searches of the Keowns' hard drives took several months, and the number of hits on some of the search terms was actually stunning. For example, there were over 20,000 searches for Sprite, which was Julie's favorite drink. Cyanide was looked up and ethylene glycol, but those weren't the only poisons that he'd researched on his laptop. Files that James had tried to delete from the computer included a search for the Anarchist Cookbook on August 17th and August 18th, 2004, and that's just weeks before Julie died. The file was huge and included information on everything from making bombs and poisons to how to kill someone with your own bare hands. Another search included the word chloroform. A search on Google for homemade poisons was also done on August 17th and 18th. In the end, investigators found that someone had used James's laptop to search for poison 20 different times before Julie's death. Prosecutors had a witness who would testify that James had suggested his wife ingested antifreeze from a Gatorade bottle. Another witness, Heather LeBlanc, would testify that James was making Julie drink Gatorade when she didn't want to. And then there was the fact that someone had searched for antifreeze and ethylene glycol poisoning on James's laptop computer. And that was a computer used solely by James. Now, when they looked at Julie's searches during this time frame, they were the complete opposite. They were all about getting healthy, getting pregnant, dealing with her kidney disease. So she clearly had not wanted to die. She wanted to get well and have a life. In November of 2005, James was arrested right in the middle of his radio show. Before he went on trial for Julie's murder, his attorneys moved to suppress evidence from the search of his laptop computer, because that was some of the most damning evidence. But this motion was denied by the trial judge.
And at the trial, the prosecution argued that James had poisoned his wife to hide from her the fact that they were on the verge of financial ruin, and to cash in on her life insurance policy. of $250,000. Now, if James is hoping to build a house, buy another BMW, and then whatever money's left over, he'd start a scholarship.
A scholarship in Julie's name.
I don't think he's got enough money there.
Well, you can build a house without paying for the whole house.
Uh-huh.
Right, you can get a mortgage. Anyway, who cares? It was all bullshit.
Yeah.
His fraud to employers and Harvard were exposed. The medical examiner testified that Julie's manner of death was inconsistent with suicide, and the multiple computer searches were submitted as evidence of his intent to kill his wife. His prior bad acts of fraud and lies were allowed into evidence because the judge found a clear connection between these and the murder.
Well, yeah.
The defense's position was that Julie's death was the result of either an accident or a suicide. So they claimed that Julie was aware of the financial troubles and her husband's lies. Their evidence for this was that Julie had told some people that her husband was at Harvard University to finish his bachelor's degree, and told others that he was enrolled in Harvard Business School. That's not that convincing. James was found guilty of first-degree murder in the poisoning death of his wife, Julie. James closed his eyes and briefly bowed his head when he heard the news. Aside from that, there was no sign of emotion from him. His mother, Betty Keown, was his one and only courtroom supporter, and she sat alone holding her Bible. It took 4 years after they lost her daughter for Jack and Nancy Oldag to finally have her killer held accountable. They were finally able to tell James how they felt, so Nancy read a prepared statement before his sentencing. As she looked at him, Nancy realized that the person she saw on the other side of the courtroom really wasn't the person she thought her daughter had married. What she did know was that losing Julie had been like losing the light from their lives, Nancy said. And there was only one person to blame, and that was James. She said, "In my mind, James is no longer a person. He's just a mass of flesh and bones taking up space on this earth. No real person would ever do such an evil thing," Nancy said. "I will forever be grateful to the justice system for bringing this self-involved evil monster to court, and to reveal to everyone what kind of person he really is. I feel like a storm has come through my life, my home, and my family."
Jack Oldag read his statement with tears in his eyes. "My wife and I were always so proud of our kids. Now he has taken half of that away from us in one of the most cowardly and brutal ways possible. It is difficult to think of the suffering she endured."
Yeah, those poor people.
So James was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole.
That's right, and none of his appeals have worked either. So he can just rot there as far as I'm concerned.
I don't think he's going anyplace.
No. Yeah, he's probably having a great time winning people over in prison, right?
Sure.
TCB's music was produced by Mike McClellan, and you can find out more about his work at his website, podcastps.com. If you have comments, a case suggestion, or even a beer recommendation, please send us an email. We love to get emails. And you can send that to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or even better, leave us a voicemail. There's a direct link in our show notes that you can click on and record your voicemail for a future show. So you might be asking yourself, how can I support True Crime Brewery and get some bonus episodes, plus get all my episodes without those stinking ads? Well, we have this all figured out for you. We have our True Crime Brewery premium option where you can get your own personal URL to add to your podcast app, and you can subscribe to our show completely free of advertisements. Plus, you get at least one special members-only episode each and every month, and we'll send you a gift and a handwritten thank you note. And of course, members can always listen to our ad-free episodes on the website as well. Or you can do the same thing on Patreon, which a few people have chosen to do that instead. If you think you'd enjoy these benefits and you'd like to help support the show, we really appreciate it, no pressure. And you could take a look at our subscribing options on our website, which is tiegrabber.com. But whether you support us by listening, sharing feedback, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, or subscribing as a premium member, we appreciate you. And as always, we thank you for coming to the quiet end.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, let's listen to Dara's voicemail, which is some comments that I'm interested to hear.
Hi, Jill and Dick. Happy New Year and greetings from Ireland. It's Dara here. I just wanted to say, look, I'm really enjoying the cases, and I'm very loyal to you guys because yours was the first true crime podcast I ever listened to, and so I'm very grateful for that. But I just have one pet peeve, and that is the tie grabber website that you use. Like, it doesn't pause where you are. So if I'm listening to a podcast and I have to go off and do something and come back, I need to actually fast forward it or to where I was. It doesn't actually pause it if you move away from the screen. I don't know if that's something that can be rectified, but it's just quite frustrating as a listener. That's all. But look, I love your content, and I'm going to keep on listening, but it was just a little bit of feedback, that's all. And sure, look, I hope you have a great year, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Dara. Love that accent. Wonderful. So as far as the little glitch on the website, I'm sure it can be fixed. It's just that I am not as computer literate as I would need to be to do that on my own. So I'm going to pass that little bit of information on to our IT people, and hopefully we can get that taken care of for you in the near future. And thank you for being a loyal listener. We really do appreciate it. You love the accent?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I know. It's great. All right, let's listen to a voicemail from Krista with a case suggestion.
Krista has a very interesting case.
Hello, Dick and Jill. Long-time listener from your very first episode. So there was a episode a couple of weeks ago where you said you were surprised that people actually listen to you. Well, lots of people listen to you, so you shouldn't be surprised because you guys are really good. My case suggestion is about Rafi Kodikian and David Coughlin, who were best friends, lost in Rattlesnake Canyon in the New Mexico desert, where Rafi stabbed to death his best friend David. There's a few books written on this case, and I can't remember, because you guys have done a lot of episodes, I can't remember if you've done this case before, but it's very fascinating. So, and Dick, I don't have any beer suggestions, and I'm sorry, because I don't drink beer. I don't drink anything, but I really enjoy the beer reviews. And every time I hear a review, I would really like to have a beer. So you're that convincing. Anyway, keep up the good work. And I listen every 2 weeks faithfully. And good luck and Happy New Year. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Krista. Happy New Year to you and all of our listeners. So this is like a really funky case. What do we know about it, Dickie?
Well, these two guys were best friends from college, and they've graduated and they're working, and they decide, because one of them, I think Coughlin, was going to be doing some post-grad work in California or something. So they do this cross-country trip, and they decide, let's go hiking. And they're in Carlsbad Caverns National Park, hiking Rattlesnake Canyon. Now, we haven't been there.
Well, no, if you're going to call something a rattlesnake, I'm not going.
Just got to look out for them. So they got lost, and unfortunately, I mean, it's summer. I think it was August or something. So you know how hot it gets in the New Mexican desert.
Murder, yeah, it's terrible.
The other thing is, while they had a topographical map with them, neither of them could read it.
Oh, gee.
So they're lost.
Yeah.
They have minimal amounts of fluid because they didn't expect to become lost.
Sure.
They're getting dehydrated. And Coughlin began vomiting, and he thought he was dying. They felt that poorly. So he asked Kodikian to put him out of his misery, which he did. He stabbed Coughlin to death. And then apparently he tried to slash his own wrists, but he was unsuccessful.
Okay, well, I need to know a lot more here. I have a lot of questions.
Well, you're not going to get to do that until we do the case.
Okay, because I want to know, were they really out of fluid? Were they really lost? And put me out of my misery. Okay, stabbing to death doesn't sound like the best way to do that. Where was he stabbed? Do we know?
Don't know.
Okay. And then who found them, right? Because they were lost.
They were lost, but people were looking for them, and park rangers found them.
Okay, well, Krista, this is some fascinating shit you've brought to us, so I am really going to look into this. I have a lot of questions about it.
It's going to be a good case.
Yeah, it's a good one. I've never heard of it, so good job, Krista, bringing that.
I'll just do one. There was one other thing. He pled guilty to second-degree murder. The judge apparently agreed with his story that it was kind of a mercy killing because he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but all was suspended except for 2 years.
Well, stabbing to death sounds brutal. It doesn't sound like putting someone out of their misery unless you, just went right for an artery and sliced it.
Well, but they didn't have too many ways of killing each other.
All right, well, there's just a lot more we need to know.
Yes, there is. I thought that would be an interesting topic.
Absolutely, and I agree about the beer. Even some beers I'm not crazy about, I'll hear a review and it just sounds fantastic.
Oh, that's how I work it.
You're very good at it.
I'm going to convince everybody.
Well, isn't that how you convinced me to marry you, saying how fantastic you are and convincing me that marriage to you would be wonderful?
That was one of my goals.
Yeah, it worked.
And you fell for it.
Well, it really is wonderful.
Shucks.
Okay, we have an email.
Okay.
You read the email from Kevin.
I'm going to read Kevin's email. So he says, I'm a longtime listener and enthusiastic fan of your podcasts, consistently thorough and thoughtful approach to challenging subjects. I write to point out something I noted in your reporting of 2 recent cases. In a murder in the family, Ruianne Park.
Yeah, this was a bonus members-only episode we did recently.
Ms. Park's daughter, Linda Martin, admitted to killing her. Now, in discussing the case, you appeared to accept Ms. Martin's version of the murder, that it was a spontaneous act of blind rage, and you accepted it at face value. Given that there were no witnesses, and the daughter had a clear motive to tell a story that would rule out premeditation, the better approach would have been to express some skepticism about the daughter's explanation.
Okay, now he has something to say about another case, but let's address this one first.
Yeah, I thought we'd do them one at a time.
Yeah. So I think he's probably right that we just went ahead and accepted it, because from what we read, and I think we even saw a crime show about it, it seemed like that was the case.
Right.
But certainly we could have been more skeptical. It's just, I go into things with an opinion a lot. I think most people will agree with me on that. And then I just kind of stick to that opinion, although I try and look at all the facts. But that's why we have feedback, so people can call me out on my stuff. So yeah, I think that that's a good point.
Well, and I would just reiterate one thing you said, that every source I looked at said that it was an act of blind rage.
Sure. But it's always good to kind of sit back and be skeptical and really think things through. Sometimes it's hard to just stand back and really take an objective look at everything, especially after you're hearing the same thing from all these sources. But yeah, I think that's a fair point. So go on with the rest of it.
Okay. The other case is a killer at the door. That's not exactly what he wanted to talk about. He wanted to talk about the follow-up discussion.
Oh, okay.
Where I provided an update on the investigation into the murders of the 4 Idaho College students. And he says, both of you commented as if it had already been established that the suspect in custody is the murderer. And while there is certainly evidence pointing to his guilt, presumably that's why he was arrested for the crimes, it's still very early in the case, and some prominent criminal defense lawyers have pointed out holes in the evidence. I'm an attorney, and while I know nothing about criminal law that I didn't learn in a single law school class 35 years ago, I consider myself well-versed in evaluating evidence. Your podcast is so well done and enjoyed by so many listeners that I can't help but take note when your discussion very occasionally veers into speculation.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Actually, I love that you're doing that, and I hope you'll keep doing that. That's what feedback is really all about, at least
That's
partially.
Right.
Yeah. I think that we probably did just kind of assume he's guilty, and I think, though, that most of the media coverage does the same thing. I think really we're not that great in our country. We say that people are innocent until proven guilty, but it's really not the way we talk or act or treat them for the most part.
Exactly.
But yeah, that's a fair point too. He is innocent until proven guilty. I just wish, Kevin, that you would have included what the prominent criminal defense lawyers have pointed out about holes in the evidence, because I'd love to know that. Now, one thing about updating it is we only put out an episode every 2 weeks, so much happens in that time. I feel like the update we were giving, people already knew for the most part.
Let's take the DNA evidence.
Yeah, let's do that.
So here's this knife sheath that has his DNA on it. So that's in the house where the killings occurred. But it doesn't mean that he brought it into the house.
No, it doesn't.
This could have come from almost anywhere and been deposited in the house.
That's right. And I kind of wondered, was he doing it all alone? We really don't know.
No.
We're just kind of talking about what we've heard. It's not like we know what happened.
Yeah.
No.
But Kevin rightfully points out that, yeah, I jumped the gun on that.
Yeah, but I think that most of us do.
Yeah.
And we probably shouldn't.
Right.
Because if you were innocent, it would be really hard to have the whole world calling you a murderer. Even though in this case, it looks pretty damn likely, like he is guilty.
Well, I'm sure there's more evidence that they have.
Well, there might be more evidence that he did it, but there also might be some exculpatory evidence out there we don't know about.
Sure.
So it's really just speculation. Well, thanks, Kevin.
I watched both the 48 Hours and the Dateline episodes on it, and they were informative episodes, but they didn't give really any new information.
Not a lot, no. That's why I'm not a big fan of covering cases that are still pending. I kind of like to know the outcome before I talk too much about it.
Right.
But thanks, Kevin. I really do hope that you will keep an eye on us and send us more, because I appreciate that. That's great.
It is.
And you know what? All of our listeners are like the best.
Well, of course they are.
And they're kind to us. Well, thanks for the feedback. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We appreciate you so much. You don't even have any idea. And we'll see you next time at the quiet end.
We'll save some seeds.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.